It was a quiet evening in the house, one of those nights when silence felt heavier than usual. My husband was out of town for work again, leaving me alone to tend to the house and keep myself occupied. It was during these long nights that I often found myself reflecting on life, on choices made and paths taken. There was always an undercurrent of loneliness that crept in, no matter how much I tried to ignore it. The house was dimly lit, and I was lost in my thoughts when I heard a faint sound coming from the bathroom. At first, I dismissed it as the creaks and groans of an old house settling in the night. But the sound persisted, subtle yet distinct curiosity piqued. I got up to investigate. As I approached the bathroom door, I hesitated. It was partially ajar, the soft yellow light spilling into the hallway for a moment. I debated whether to turn back. After all, this was my stepson's space, his private moment, but something, perhaps concern, perhaps curiosity, compelled me to step closer from the slight opening. I could see him standing by the sink, shirtless, water dripping down his arms. He seemed preoccupied, focused on washing himself and utterly unaware of my presence. My initial reaction was one of shock. He was no longer the boy I had met years ago. He had grown into a young man, tall and lean, with a quiet confidence that I hadn't fully noticed before. I felt a wave of awkwardness. I shouldn't be here, shouldn't be watching. But my feet remained rooted to the spot, my mind raised with thoughts. Was he okay? Was he hurt? Or was this just a normal part of his routine that I had stumbled upon? The maternal side of me wanted to intervene, to offer guidance, but another part of me, a part one wasn't proud of, felt something else entirely, just as I was about to step back and retreat to my room. He looked up. His eyes met mine, wide with surprise and embarrassment. There was a moment of stillness where neither of us moved or spoke. Time seemed to stretch endlessly in that brief second. I didn't know anyone was home. He stammered, his voice breaking the silence. "I thought you might need help." I blurted out, my voice shaky and unconvincing, even to my own ears. His cheeks flushed red, and he turned away slightly, clearly mortified by the situation. "No, I'm fine, I can handle it." But I didn't leave. Instead, I found myself stepping into the room, closing the distance between us. "It's okay," I said softly, trying to sound reassuring. "I've raised you since you were a boy. If there's something you need help with, you can tell me." There was a vulnerability in his expression, a mix of embarrassment and relief. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he muttered, barely audible. His head bowed. What had started as an innocent moment of concern was rapidly becoming something else, something I wasn't prepared for. I stepped closer, my voice softer now, attempting to ease his discomfort. "There's nothing to be embarrassed about," I said, though my own nerves were beginning to show. He didn't reply immediately, his gaze fixed downward as if trying to make himself invisible. The vulnerability in his posture tugged at something maternal in me, but it was complicated by an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite name. I just didn't know what to do. He finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's different now." He gestured vaguely, as though words failed to fully explain. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the mix of shame and confusion. And I knew this wasn't just a moment to brush off lightly. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain an air of calm authority, despite the odd situation. "That's normal," I replied, my tone gentle but firm. "It's part of growing up, learning how to take care of yourself." I reached for a towel, handing it to him as a way to create some distance here. "Let's start with this." He hesitated, but took it, his hands trembling slightly as he began. Drying himself, he looked up at me, his expression unsure. "You really don't think it's weird?" he asked, his voice carrying a mix of hope and doubt. I shook my head, trying to offer him reassurance. "Not at all," I said, though my own thoughts were anything but clear. "Everyone goes through changes. It's nothing to feel ashamed of." I was speaking to him, but I couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the air between us. It wasn't overt or intentional, but it was there. A faint ripple of tension that neither of us fully acknowledged. You make it sound so easy, he said with a small, nervous laugh. But it doesn't feel that way. That's because it's new, I replied, leaning against the sink to seem less imposing. It takes time to figure things out. But you will. You're not a kid anymore. And that comes with its own challenges. My words felt almost automatic, an attempt to steer the moment back to something safe and manageable. He nodded slowly, his grip on the towel tightening. I don't know if I'm doing things right. He admitted, his voice laced with vulnerability. Sometimes it feels like I don't know what I'm supposed to do. The honesty in his words caught me off guard. This wasn't just about the awkwardness of the moment. It was about something deeper. A fear of inadequacy that I hadn't seen in him before without thinking. I reached out, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder. You're doing fine, I said softly. You'll get through this and you'll be okay. His gaze met mine again, and for a moment the air seemed to still. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Gratitude, maybe, or something more complicated I couldn't tell. And I wasn't sure I wanted to know. All I knew was that this was a moment neither of us would forget. The hours following the encounter were filled with an uncomfortable quiet. I tried to immerse myself in routine tasks, folding laundry, tidying up the living room, but my mind refused to let go of what had transpired. Every small sound in the house made me flinch. My senses heightened, as though someone might discover the moment I was now replaying over and over in my head. My stepson was unusually quiet as well. Normally, he'd spend time in the kitchen or watching television in the evenings, but tonight he stayed in his room. I could hear faint movements behind his door, but he didn't come out. I wondered what he was thinking. Whether he was as caught up in the memory of our interaction as I was. Guilt began to gnaw at me, slow and unrelenting. What had I done? I told myself it had been innocent, a moment of concern for someone I had helped raise. But the justifications rang hollow. The lines between care and something else entirely had blurred, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. The weight of it sat heavy in my chest. And that wouldn't go away. I found myself pacing the kitchen, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. What if he told someone? What if my husband noticed something was off? The thought of his suspicion, of his anger, made my stomach churn. But more than fear of discovery, there was a deeper shame that I couldn't shake. I had crossed a line not just in action, but in thought, and I couldn't undo it. When I finally heard his door open, my quickened. His footsteps were hesitant, almost reluctant. As he came into the kitchen, he avoided my gaze, at first reaching for a glass of water. The tension between us was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken I'm sorry about earlier, he said suddenly, his voice breaking the heavy silence. He set the glass down and glanced at me, his expression unsure. I shook my head quickly, forcing a smile that I hoped looked natural. You don't need to apologize, I said, trying to keep my tone light. It wasn't a big deal, but the words felt forced, almost dismissive, and I could see he didn't believe them. I didn't mean to make things weird. He continued, his brow furrowed. I didn't know how to handle it, and then you. He trailed off, his cheeks flushing red. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. It's okay, I said again, this time more softly. We don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. I was desperate to move past this, to erase the awkwardness that hung between us like a fog. But he shook his head. I think we should, he said, surprising me because it feels, I don't know, it feels like I messed up. His words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to tell him he hadn't done anything wrong. But the truth was more complicated. We both bore responsibility for what had happened, and I couldn't absolve either of us entirely. Instead, I reached for the glass he had set down, my fingers trembling slightly. You didn't mess up, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's just one of those moments, things happen and we move on. He looked at me, then his eyes searching mine for something, reassurance perhaps, or understanding. I wasn't sure I could give him either. What I did know was that this moment, like the one before, it would leave a mark. The days that followed were marked by a strange silence. Each of us navigating the unspoken tension in our own way. I threw myself into the mundane, keeping busy with housework and errands. Anything to keep my mind from drifting back to that moment. But avoidance wasn't enough to quell the unease that lingered. Every glance in his direction felt loaded. Every interaction carefully measured. My husband returned home that weekend, oblivious to the shift in the household dynamic. He was his usual self, chatty, affectionate, and completely unaware of the growing distance between his wife and his son. Watching him settle back into his routine, I felt the weight of my guilt deepen. How could I sit across from him at dinner exchange, small talk, and pretend everything was fine? It didn't help that my stepson was quieter than usual. He avoided direct conversation with both of us, keeping his responses short, and to the point. The lively report he once shared with his father seemed muted, replaced by a strained politeness that didn't go unnoticed. "Is everything okay with him?" My husband asked one evening as we were cleaning up after dinner. His voice was casual, but I could hear the concern behind it. I froze for a moment, my hands stilling over the sink. "He's probably just stressed," I said, forcing a lightness into my tone. "You know how teenagers can be." He nodded, seeming satisfied with my explanation, but I could feel his eyes lingering on me. I avoided his gaze, focusing on scrubbing a plate that was already clean that night. I lay awake in bed, the darkness pressing in around me. My husband's even breathing beside me only amplified the noise in my head. I couldn't keep living like this. Caught between the guilt of what had happened and the fear of it coming to light, something had to give. The next day, I found my stepson in the backyard, sitting on the edge of the porch with his head bowed. He looked up as I approached, his expression wary but resigned. I sat down beside him, leaving enough space to avoid making him uncomfortable. "We need to talk," I said quietly. My voice steadied despite the nervous flutter in my chest. He didn't respond immediately. His eyes fixed on the ground when he finally spoke. His voice was low. "I've been thinking about it a lot," he said. "I don't know how to act around you anymore. It's like everything's different now." His honesty disarmed me. "I know," I admitted. "And I hate that it's made things hard for you, for both of us. But we can't let this define how we see each other." He glanced at me, then his expression conflicted. "Do you really think we can just forget it?" I sighed, choosing my words carefully. "Maybe not forget, but we can move forward. We're family, and that has to mean something. It doesn't erase what happened, but it doesn't have to ruin us either." For a long moment, we sat in silence. Then he nodded, his posture relaxing slightly. "I want things to go back to normal," he said, his voice tinged with hope. "So do I," I replied. Meaning it, as I walked back into the house, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least we had taken the first step, and for now, that was enough.